Okay, class. In the last video, General Reproductive Physiology 2, we stopped at regulation of sexual development. We talked about testes determining factor, SRY, malaria inhibiting factor, testosterone to develop towards a male versus a female. We explained that you would develop towards a female unless you had testosterone and MIF to convert the female to the male, essentially. Okay, so going a little further. Basically, the external genitalia, the first 6 weeks you can't tell the difference, okay, in utero. They have the urogenital sinus, they have the two labroscrotal swellings, the genital tubercle, urethral folds. Testosterone is necessary to cause this external male genitalia to occur. Testosterone, again, coming from interstitial cells of ladies. And to develop the scrotum, the prostate gland, the spongy urethra. Without this, you will get the labia and clitoris. So going to it again. The male penis is the homologue of the clitoris. So if testosterone is not there in adequate amounts, and works, then the person would have the clitoris. The labia majora, which in the female, closes and seals, and that's what gives the scrotum. So without the testosterone, instead of having the scrotum, the person would have the labia majora. Okay? All right. The masculinization occurs because, as I alluded to, testosterone is secreted from the interstitial cells of lady in the testes, but in certain cells it will be converted to dihydroxytestosterone, another androgen, if the enzyme 5-alpha reductase is present. And this is a major enzyme in causing the changes that can occur here to form the male system. Also some changes in brain development. Here, testosterone, which is a steroid, is sent to certain target cells, and in those target cells, the 5-alpha reductase converts this from testosterone to dihydrotestosterone, and part in making some of the changes necessary for the external genitalia. Here is a timetable showing when changes will occur, and in some cases, showing what would be responsible for those changes. Okay. So we'll go a little further. We'll go further here. Okay. Now, hermaphrodism is a situation in which there's a confusion and you actually have both sexes to a certain extent. Whether it be the internal reproductive, which would be the ovaries and testes, or the external secondary, which would be the penis, the clitoris, and so forth. Okay. Now, true hermaphrodism, which is oftentimes called true hermaphrodism, the internal genitalia could be this possibility. It could be an ovary on one side and a testes on the other, okay? Or it could be an ovotestes, which means the internal organ is part ovary, part testes, and that could be on both sides, or it could be one ovotestes could be on one side, and a testes or ovary could be on the other side. So different possibilities. But when you speak of hermaphrodism true, you're looking mainly at the internal genitalia. Okay? And the problem is due to zygotic mutation. Not every cell receives the full Y chromosome. So the cells that don't receive the full Y chromosome, those cells that have migrated to the gonads and do not receive the full Y chromosome in the gonadal area, those cells that have done the migration, then what will end up happening is that they won't have the SRY gene and the testes determining factor, so therefore that's where the confusion would come in. Some cells would, some cells wouldn't. Some cells would, some cells wouldn't. So it has to do with that Y chromosome. Okay. Pseudohermaphrodism is that the internal genitalia is okay. Ovary or testes. But the outside genitalia, the accessory, is not. Okay? So in the female pseudohermaphrodism, there's a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. I'll say it again. Congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Now, you've talked about the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland has a cortex and a medulla. In the cortex, that's where steroid hormones. The three zones of the cortex would be the zona glomerulosa, the fasciculata, and the reticularis. The reticularis is where androgens can be produced. Okay, so in females that have an overactive adrenal cortex in the reticularis area, it could produce a tremendous amount of male hormone, which could cause the external genitalia to become male-like because of that excess testosterone and androgens. Okay, so they have both the Müllerian and Wolffian ducts derivative, but male external genitalia. Okay, male external genitalia. All right. Males may be due to testicular feminization. Now, what that is that the testosterone is produced, interstitial cells, but the receptors don't work. So then, essentially, if the receptors don't work, basically the testosterone's not working. So the female external genitalia form, but there's no uterus or fallopian tubes because the Müllerian duct is still degenerated. Okay? Why is that? Because of Müllerian inhibiting factor. There's no male tract either because the Wolffian duct has not been stimulated. May also be because of inability to make the 5-alpha reductase. Remember, that's the enzyme that converts testosterone to hydroxytestosterone. So in this case, then, the male pseudohermaphrodism would basically be this, that the outside basically looks more female, but the inside is male, whereas the female would be exactly the opposite of pseudohermaphrodism. Okay. Now we're to endocrine regulation of reproduction. Endocrine regulation of reproduction. Okay. So in this particular aspect here, endocrine regulation, the testes stop making testosterone about the third trimester, and the ovaries don't make embryonic sex hormones. The sex hormone secretion does not occur again in either sex until the gonads are stimulated at puberty. Okay. At this time, the anterior pituitary begins releasing gonadotropic hormones. Okay, class, right here, this is the pituitary gland and some target glands. Okay, just a quick review. The hypothalamus releases something called releasing factors and inhibiting factors. Those chemicals travel down a portal system to the anterior pituitary. Now, the pituitary gland is made up of two combined areas. The pituitary gland has a posterior pituitary and an anterior. The posterior pituitary produces things like oxytocin, things of that nature there. And the anterior pituitary produces several trophic hormones. A trophic hormone is a hormone that can go to another gland and produce a hormone. Okay? So the posterior pituitary does oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The anterior pituitary produces these trophic hormones. Now, in this particular case, the trophic hormones I'm interested in this particular thing, would be the ones that go to to the gonads, testes and ovaries. Okay, those are called gonadotropins. Gonadotropins. Those gonadotropins would be FSH, known as follicle stimulating hormone, and LH, known as luteinizing hormone, that would cause the various gonads, you're only seeing the testes here, the various gonads, to produce those hormones, the estrogens and the progesterones and the androgens and so forth of that nature. So again, as we said, the hypothalamus sends out releasing factors and inhibiting factors to the anterior pituitary, which sends it to the gonads. The testes stop making testosterone by the third trimester. They made it up until then in order to help with the development of the genitalia. Then it stops, goes way down, and then really for a long time, both the female and the male have the same levels of hormones, and then it doesn't kick back up again until puberty, where the levels start to rise. At this time, the anterior pituitary starts releasing gonadotropic hormones. So again, when we look at that, the hypothalamus releases the gonadotropin releasing hormones. That sends a message to the anterior pituitary to produce LH and FSH, which are gonadotropins. Okay, gonadotropic hormone again makes another gland produce a hormone. Then that would go into the bloodstream. Hormones travel by the bloodstream. The testes would cause testosterone to be produced, interstitial cells of Leydig. And then these hormones would also cause the ovaries to produce the estrogen and progesterone that we'll be talking about it more in the female there. Okay? So we go a little further. Follicle stimulating hormone, FSH and LH, are produced in the anterior pituitary of both males and females. The effects of those particular hormones, they work both on male, is to stimulate spermatogenesis or oogenesis. That's meiosis, to make sperm and egg. Stimulate gonadal hormone secretion, which you see here, and maintain the structure of the gonads, because in a female that undergoes menopause, she starts losing, well, obviously the ovaries stop working, the vagina's mucosa starts to get thinner, and those aspects there. Okay. The regulation of FSH and LH is controlled by gonadotropin releasing hormones, which are in the hypothalamus. There's a negative feedback loop that you see here. So everything feeds back to keep everything in the proper homeostatic range. The rising levels of hormones would inhibit not only the gonadotropin releasing hormone, but also, as you can see here, also directly the secretion in the anterior pituitary. There. Again, the regulation of FSH and LH is controlled by release of gonadotropins from the hypothalamus, and is regulated by negative feedback. This negative feedback will not only inhibit the hypothalamus, but the anterior pituitary from the FSH and LH. The regulation continues. Aside from the usual gonadotropin hormones, testosterone, estradiol, which is progesterone, the gonads also secrete something called inhibin. Inhibin is a polypeptide. It is secreted by the Sertoli cells, again, which were the nursing cells. This was in the testes, sustenacula. These were the same cells that did the myth. And secreted by the granulosa cells. These are cells that we haven't discussed, but they surround the oocyte. And they inhibit FSH, but have no effect on LH. So this is a polypeptide to inhibit FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which causes the follicles to grow in the female.